85% of all potash used by American farmers comes from one country. 90% of the leafy greens Americans eat in winter are imported. 60% of crude oil imports flow from a single source. And that source is not a distant adversary. It is the nation directly to the north. Canada. Right now, a trade confrontation is threatening to sever one of the most critical supply relationships in American history. And almost nobody is talking about the food implications. This analysis examines the hidden dependencies that connect American grocery stores to Canadian farms, mines, and power plants. The tariffs that are disrupting these connections, the fertilizer crisis that could reshape American agriculture, and why this matters far more than the political headlines suggest. The relationship between American food and Canadian resources runs deeper than most realize. Start with what goes into the ground. American agriculture depends on three primary nutrients: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Without these elements, crops cannot grow. Modern farming would be impossible. Potassium comes primarily in the form of potash, and the United States imports nearly 90% of its potash supply. Of that imported potash, 85% comes from Canada. This is not a diversified supply chain. This is near total dependence on a single source. The numbers are stark. According to the Fertilizer Institute, potash is an irreplaceable component of modern agricultural production. The United States has historically sourced nearly all the potash used by farmers from international markets. Potash deposits are geographically specific. Mine development in the United States is time-intensive and costly. Canada holds the world's largest potash reserves, concentrated primarily in Saskatchewan. Canadian company Nutrien is the world's largest potash producer. When American farmers need this essential nutrient, they have essentially one place to turn. The tariff situation has created unprecedented uncertainty. In February 2025, President Trump signed executive orders imposing 25% tariffs on most Canadian imports. Energy products, including potash, initially faced a lower 10% rate. But the threat of higher tariffs has disrupted planning across the agricultural sector. According to fertilizer analysts, when tariffs were announced, some Canadian producers stopped taking American orders for deliveries that would arrive after the tariff effective date. Importers could not predict what they would owe. Farmers could not plan their costs. The calendar worked against everyone. Spring planting waits for no one. Corn planting begins in southern states by late winter. Farmers need fertilizer in place before they can plant. A supply disruption in February or March affects the entire growing season. The timing could not be worse. The cost implications ripple through the entire food system. According to USDA data, fertilizer can comprise up to 40% of some crop production costs. When potash prices rise, corn prices rise. When corn prices rise, livestock feed prices rise. When feed prices rise, meat prices rise. The connection runs from Canadian mines to American dinner tables. The Fertilizer Institute stated clearly that restrictions on critical cross-border trade will drive up costs for farmers, which could ultimately be felt at the grocery store by consumers. This is not speculation. This is the direct consequence of supply chain economics. But potash is only part of the story. Canada also supplies American growers with nearly 10% of their nitrogen fertilizer needs. This represents 25% of total American nitrogen fertilizer imports. Additionally, Canada provides nearly 20% of sulfur consumed by American farmers and industrial users. And there is another factor that connects nitrogen fertilizer to Canadian energy. More than 90% of American natural gas imports come from Canada. Natural gas is a key input in ammonia production, which is the basis for most nitrogen fertilizers. So even domestically produced nitrogen fertilizer often depends on Canadian natural gas. The dependencies compound, they reinforce each other. Cutting one connection affects multiple others. Fresh produce tells another part of this story. American consumers have grown accustomed to year-round availability of fresh fruits and vegetables. Tomatoes in January, lettuce in February, berries throughout the winter months. This abundance depends on imports. According to USDA Economic Research Service data, imports supply 60% of fresh fruit and 38% of fresh vegetables consumed in the United States. Mexico leads in most categories, but Canada plays a significant role, particularly in greenhouse-grown produce. Canada accounts for 20% 40% of fresh vegetable imports by value. This includes substantial quantities of greenhouse tomatoes, peppers, and cucumbers. Canadian greenhouse operations supply American markets, especially during winter months when domestic production falls. The import share has been growing steadily. Between 2007 and 2021, the percentage of American fresh fruit and vegetable availability supplied by imports grew dramatically. For some crops, including asparagus, bell peppers, blueberries, broccoli, cauliflower, cucumbers, raspberries, snap beans, and tomatoes, the import share increased by more than 20 percentage points. This is not a temporary situation. This reflects structural changes in where and how American food is grown. Energy flows add another layer of dependency. Canada is the largest source of American energy imports. This includes crude oil, natural gas, and electricity. The two countries share more than 30 major cross-border electric transmission lines. Their grids are fully interconnected. In 2023, Canada supplied 58% of the volume of hydrocarbons imported by the United States. More specifically, Canada provided 60% of American crude oil imports and close to 100% of natural gas imports. For electricity specifically, Canada was the source of 85% of the electrical energy imported by the United States. While total electricity trade represents a small share of overall consumption, it is locally critical. States along the northern border depend heavily on Canadian power. Maine receives 44% of its power from Canadian sources. When imports from Quebec and Newfoundland are added, Maine's dependence on Canadian electricity reaches 64%. Minnesota relies on Manitoba for significant portions of its electricity needs. These are not theoretical dependencies. They affect real people in real communities every day. The regional impacts vary considerably. New England and New York have historically relied on hydropower from Quebec. This clean, relatively inexpensive electricity has helped meet renewable energy goals while keeping costs manageable. When Canadian hydropower imports decline, as they did during recent drought conditions, these regions must find alternatives. The Midwest faces different challenges. The Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, which oversees transmission in several states, including Minnesota, has anticipated supply shortfalls. Coal plant retirements, growing demand, and slower than expected new generation coming online all contribute. Canadian imports help fill the gap. The tariff implementation has already caused damage. According to the Congressional Research Service, as of January 2026, tariffs of 25% apply to most Canadian imports under the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. Energy and potash imports face a lower 10% rate. Additionally, tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, lumber, vehicles, and auto parts have been imposed under various authorities. Canada has responded with retaliatory measures. Counter tariffs on American goods have affected multiple sectors. While many Canadian counter tariffs on food and agricultural products were removed in September 2025, the damage had already occurred. Canadian export volume dropped 7.5% in the second quarter of 2025. This represented the largest quarterly decline since the 2008 recession. Manufacturing activity fell 3.2%. More than half of Canadian manufacturers reported that tariffs were affecting their businesses. The impact on American food prices is measurable. According to research from Tax Foundation, the tariffs imposed and scheduled as of January 2026 represent an average tax increase of $1,300 per American household in 2026. This includes effects across all sectors, not just food, but food represents a significant portion. Canada's food price report for 2026 projects that food prices in Canada will increase 4 to 6%. The average Canadian family of four is expected to spend over $17,500 on food, an increase of nearly $1,000 from the previous year. American consumers face similar pressures. When supply chains are disrupted, when tariffs add costs, when uncertainty prevents normal planning, prices rise. The effects compound through the system. The potash situation illustrates the broader problem. American agricultural interests have limited alternatives. Russia and Belarus are major potash producers, but geopolitical tensions and sanctions make them unreliable sources. China accounts for part of global potash trade, but tensions there create similar concerns. Canada, Russia, Belarus, and China together account for 78% of global potash trade. The United States will not purchase from Russia and Belarus due to sanctions and political considerations. This leaves Canada as essentially the only reliable large-scale supplier. According to fertilizer market analysts, this situation could result in artificially inflated potash prices in the United States. American farmers may pay more than farmers in other countries for the same essential input. This affects competitiveness in global agricultural markets. The timeline for developing domestic alternatives is long. Potash mining requires substantial capital investment. New mine development takes years. The United States has some potash deposits, but they are limited compared to Canadian reserves. Building domestic capacity would take a decade or more and cost billions of dollars. In the meantime, American agriculture remains dependent on Canadian supply. Tariffs represent a tax on this dependence. The tax falls ultimately on American farmers and consumers. The fertilizer situation connects to broader food security questions. Food security has traditionally focused on production capacity. Can a country grow enough food to feed its population? By this measure, the United States is highly food secure. American agriculture produces enormous surpluses for export. But food security also depends on inputs. Modern agriculture requires fertilizer, energy, machinery, and labor. Disruptions to any of these inputs can affect food production. The United States is not self-sufficient in agricultural inputs. This represents a vulnerability that policymakers have largely ignored. The focus on manufactured goods and technology has obscured the basic dependencies that make American food production possible. The energy dimension deserves particular attention. Natural gas prices affect fertilizer production costs. When American natural gas supplies are tight, producers can import from Canada. This flexibility helps stabilize costs. Tariffs on Canadian natural gas would remove this buffer. Electricity imports help balance grids during peak demand. When American power plants cannot meet demand, imports from Canada prevent blackouts. This is not a luxury. It is a critical reliability function. The interconnected nature of North American energy systems developed over decades. Pipelines, transmission lines, and trading arrangements were built to optimize the entire continental system. Disrupting these connections harms efficiency on both sides. The political dynamics complicate resolution. President Trump has characterized tariffs as leverage for broader negotiations. The stated justifications include concerns about fentanyl trafficking and immigration. These concerns, whatever their merit, are not directly related to fertilizer or electricity. Canada has responded with a combination of retaliation and negotiation. Prime Minister Mark Carney has emphasized Canadian willingness to defend economic interests while remaining open to dialogue. The relationship has grown tenser than at any point in recent memory. Meanwhile, American farmers need to plan their operations. They need to know what fertilizer will cost. They need to secure supplies before planting season. Political uncertainty makes normal business planning impossible. The broader trade relationship provides context. Canada was the third largest source of American goods imports in 2024, totaling $412 billion. It was the top destination for American goods exports, receiving $350 billion. When services are included, Canada ranks as the second largest American trade partner overall. Food and agriculture represent only part of this relationship, but they may be the part that most directly affects ordinary citizens. Everyone eats. Everyone pays grocery bills. Food prices affect household budgets in ways that other trade flows do not. The seasonal dimension matters significantly. American agricultural production is concentrated in certain seasons. Winter months see reduced domestic output of many crops. This is when imports become most critical. Disrupting trade in winter affects consumers most directly. Similarly, fertilizer application follows seasonal patterns. Farmers apply potash primarily in late winter and early spring before planting. Disruptions in these months cannot be easily remedied. Missed application windows affect the entire growing season. Looking forward, several scenarios are possible. If tariffs remain in place long-term, American agriculture will face sustained higher input costs. Some of this cost can be absorbed through efficiency gains. Some will be passed to consumers. Some may make American agricultural products less competitive in global markets. Domestic potash production could eventually expand, but this would take years and require substantial investment. In the meantime, the dependency remains. Negotiated resolution remains the most constructive path. Both countries benefit from integrated supply chains. Both countries have legitimate interests to protect. Finding arrangements that serve both sides requires continued dialogue. The consumer perspective is often missing from trade debates. Trade policy discussions typically focus on producers and industries. Which sectors gain from protection? Which face competition from imports? These are important questions, but they are not the only questions. Consumers pay the ultimate cost of trade barriers. Higher prices for food, energy, and other essentials affect household budgets. These effects fall disproportionately on lower-income households, which spend larger shares of income on necessities. The current tariff situation will affect American grocery bills, and the effects may not be immediate or dramatic. Supply chains have some flexibility. Prices adjust gradually, but the direction is clear. Barriers to trade raise costs. The agricultural community understands these stakes. Farm organizations have expressed concerns about tariff impacts. The Fertilizer Institute has called for open, fair, predictable, and transparent trade between the United States and Canada. Agricultural analysts have documented the dependencies and identified the risks. But agricultural voices often struggle to be heard in broader political debates. Trade policy responds to many pressures. Agricultural interests are one factor among many. The path forward requires honest assessment. The United States and Canada have built one of the most integrated economic relationships in the world. This integration has benefited both countries. It has lowered costs, increased efficiency, and supported prosperity on both sides of the border. Current tensions threaten this relationship. Tariffs impose costs. Retaliation compounds them. Uncertainty disrupts planning. The longer the confrontation continues, the more damage accumulates. Food and agriculture deserve particular attention in these discussions. The dependencies are real. The timelines are inflexible. The consequences affect every American household. Climate change adds uncertainty to agricultural production. Weather patterns are shifting. Droughts, floods, heat waves, and storms affect crop yields unpredictably. Canadian agriculture has experienced these challenges. American agriculture faces similar pressures. Integrated supply chains provide resilience against localized disruptions. When drought affects one region, supplies from elsewhere fill gaps. When floods damage crops in one area, imports from other areas maintain availability. Fragmenting these supply chains reduces resilience. Tariff barriers that discourage trade also reduce the ability to respond flexibly to production disruptions. The information gap contributes to the problem. Many Americans do not know where their food comes from. Supply chains are invisible. The connection between Canadian potash mines and American grocery stores is not obvious. This information gap allows policies to proceed without informed public debate. Education and transparency could help. Making supply chain dependencies visible would enable more informed discussion. Citizens who understand the stakes can engage more effectively in democratic processes. The choice is ultimately political. Democracies can choose to prioritize different values. National sovereignty, economic efficiency, food security, and diplomatic relationships all matter. Trade-offs among them are unavoidable. But choices should be made with clear understanding of consequences. The American food system depends on Canadian inputs in ways that cannot be quickly changed. Policies that disrupt these relationships affect real people in real ways. 85% of American potash comes from Canada. 60% of crude oil imports flow from our northern neighbor. Critical electricity supplies power northern states through Canadian connections. These are not abstract statistics. They represent the foundation of American food security and energy reliability. The trade relationship with Canada is not just about politics or leverage or negotiating tactics. It is about whether American farmers can afford to grow crops. It is about what American families pay at the grocery store. It is about keeping the lights on in communities along the northern border. The food on American tables depends on it. These stakes deserve the attention they have not yet received. The historical context illuminates how this dependency developed. North American economic integration accelerated eliminated after 1994 with the North American Free Trade Agreement. NAFTA, later replaced by the United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement in 2020, created frameworks for seamless cross-border commerce. Supply chains evolved to treat the continent as a single economic space. Agricultural trade flourished under these arrangements. Canadian farmers found reliable markets for their products. American farmers accessed Canadian inputs and equipment. Processors, distributors, and retailers built systems that crossed borders without friction. This integration was not accidental. It reflected deliberate policy choices by governments on both sides. The benefits were substantial. Lower costs, greater efficiency, more consumer choice. The North American agricultural system became one of the most productive in the world. Unwinding these arrangements carries costs that accumulate over time. The comparison with other dependencies provides perspective. American dependence on Middle Eastern oil received extensive attention over decades. Energy independence became a major policy goal. Domestic production expanded. Import sources diversified. The vulnerability gradually reduced. Canadian energy dependence is different. Canada is a friendly neighbor, a treaty ally, a democracy with shared values. The risks are lower than dependence on distant or unstable suppliers, but dependence still creates vulnerability. The potash situation resembles earlier energy dependence in some ways. Concentrated supply, limited domestic alternatives, essential input for critical sector. The parallel deserves consideration. Policy options exist for addressing these dependencies. Strategic reserves could buffer against short-term supply disruptions. The United States maintains strategic petroleum reserves for energy security. Similar approaches could apply to critical agricultural inputs like potash. Domestic production incentives could encourage development of American potash mining. Tax credits, loan guarantees, and regulatory streamlining could accelerate development. However, geological limitations constrain what is possible. Supply chain diversification could reduce concentration risk. Developing relationships with additional suppliers, even at higher cost, provides insurance against disruption. The costs of diversification must be weighed against the benefits of resilience. Diplomatic engagement remains the most direct approach. Resolving trade disputes through negotiation preserves the benefits of integration while addressing legitimate concerns. This requires both sides to prioritize the relationship. The current trajectory is unsustainable for many households. Food prices in Canada have risen over 30% since 2019. American households face similar pressures. When tariffs add costs, these already stretched budgets face additional strain. Food insecurity is rising in both countries. Food bank visits have increased substantially. More families struggle to afford adequate nutrition. Trade policies that raise food costs worsen these trends. The connection between trade policy and kitchen tables deserves emphasis. Abstract discussions of tariff rates and trade balances miss the human dimension. Families making difficult choices about what they can afford to eat represent the real stakes. The business perspective also warrants consideration. American food companies have invested heavily in North American supply chains. Facilities, logistics networks, supplier relationships all reflect decades of development. Tariffs disrupt these investments. Some companies may shift operations to avoid tariffs. This could mean moving production out of the United States. Jobs and economic activity could follow. The protectionist intent of tariffs could produce opposite effects. Uncertainty itself imposes costs. Companies cannot plan effectively when they do not know what rules will apply. Investment decisions get delayed. Hiring freezes take effect. The economy suffers from paralysis as well as direct tariff costs. The resolution timeline matters significantly. Every month of continued disruption causes additional damage. Supply relationships take time to rebuild once broken. Trust, once lost, recovers slowly. The longer current tensions persist, the harder resolution becomes. Agricultural cycles impose their own deadlines. Planting seasons cannot be postponed. Fertilizer must be in place when crops need it. Missing one season affects the entire year. Multiple disrupted seasons compound the damage. The urgency is real, even if political attention is elsewhere. Other crises and controversies compete for attention. But the slow accumulation of trade damage continues regardless of what dominates headlines. This analysis has attempted to illuminate these connections. The dependencies are real. The risks are substantial. The stakes affect every household. Understanding these facts is essential for constructive policy. The question is not whether to have a relationship with Canada. The question is what kind of relationship to have. The current trajectory is damaging. A better path is possible. Finding it requires honest assessment, sustained engagement, and willingness to compromise. The decisions being made right now will determine what Americans pay for food in the years ahead. They deserve more attention than they are receiving.